We're going to talk about scalability within the blockchain ecosystem. From Ethereum layer 2s to app chain rollups, scalability continues to be a major pain point for the future of blockchain technology. This panel is going to focus on a variety of scaling options, understanding their technical differences, and some of the biggest upcoming challenges for blockchain. It's going to be led by Nikita Popik, a fourth-year business major at Tech, who recently completed a crypto-focused investment banking internship and also does research for blockchain at Georgia Tech. On the panel, we have Lydia Hylton, another GT alum, and Aryan Sheikhalian. Lydia is a partner at Bain Capital Crypto, where she focuses on early-stage DeFi, consumer, and DAO-focused applications and protocols. Aryan is an investor and the head of research at CMT Digital, focusing on blockchain research and venture. Please join me in welcoming them to the Zoom.
So to start, the blockchain trilemma, it's a very widely discussed challenge, as I'm sure you're aware, regarding the challenges that blockchains face in regards to offering centralization, security, and scalability. And today we're going to focus on that scalability piece of the puzzle. Blockchain should be able to process an enormous number of transactions and users without faltering by increasing transaction times or increasing fees. So to begin, it'd be great to get your perspective on kind of what makes a blockchain scalable. What does it mean for a blockchain to be scalable, and why is it important?
I think the importance really stems from user experience and the pain that's associated with very high fees. I think Ethereum only processes 20 or 30 transactions per second. So I don't know if any of you guys were buying NFTs last year, but I remember paying $120 in transaction fees to buy an NFT. And so that's obviously a terrible user experience. And Visa processes 25,000 transactions per second. So if you actually want to talk about recreating the financial rails, 20 or 30 transactions per second is just not going to cut it. So I think the importance is clear from a usability perspective. Scalability can mean a lot of different things. There's a lot of different directions we could go in. Maybe before I jump down a rabbit hole, I'll let Aryan jump in and add whatever is on the top of your mind.
This technical difficulty, guys. I was talking about how with scalability of blockchains, it's kind of that capability of meeting the demand without having to go through something like that cost scale alongside it. And I think, supply and demand economics of block space when it comes to blockchain technology has largely worked well until this point, but as we're looking at kind of that capitulation and onboarding of masses when we think about scalability.
Yeah. And sort of, I'm just going to start talking over you, Aryan, because I'm having trouble hearing you. Okay, so one thing I'll add is like the actual reason that block space is constrained in Ethereum is because, Ethereum, the protocol specifies that you can only fit this amount of what's called gas, which is like a sort of a proxy for the number of transactions. You can fit this much gas in a block, and there's gonna be a new block roughly every, I think it's like 10 minutes or something in Ethereum. And so there's like actually a hard limit that is set by the protocol on the number of transactions that it can process. And the reason you set this hard limit, an easy solution, right, would be to just say like, okay, let's fork Ethereum and we're just gonna change all those limits and make them much higher, and Ethereum will be way more scalable. And actually that's what Binance Smart Chain did. But it's actually it's really challenging to do that because, the nature of the blockchain is you have, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of nodes all connected to each other, and none of them wants to have to trust the other. So every single node is re-executing every single transaction on every block. And Ethereum has always placed a lot of value on being able to run a node on consumer hardware. And so like on your laptop, you should be able to run a node. That's actually become very difficult recently. We can talk about that. But if you want to be able to run a node on consumer hardware, it's actually really hard to validate transactions quickly enough such that, if miners are releasing new blocks, I need to be able to validate them before the miner releases another block. So you can't have too much throughput, or I just won't be able to keep up with the network. So that's kind of why the problem, like a layer deeper into why scalability is a tricky problem. It's that you just have a lot of people re-executing the same work.
So on Binance Smart Chain, who runs the nodes? I'm assuming it's not consumers, since it's not, if it's...
So lots of the more scalable blockchains, and in the trilemma, actually, this is a trade-off between scalability and decentralization. You can process many, many more transactions per second if you are willing to require miners and nodes to run super fancy hardware. To be clear, anyone running a proof of work miner, that is very expensive hardware. But if you are just talking about proof of stake chain and you're talking about running a node, you can vastly increase your scalability if you make it so the hardware is very, very expensive and very souped up, for lack of a better word. And you'll just end up with way fewer nodes because, not everyone is going to go out and buy like a supercomputer in order to be a node on the network. Because you could talk a little bit, if it's helpful, about the difference between a node and a validator. It might be too detailed, but you actually don't make any money as a node, and so there's not a great financial incentive to do that.
I see. So say we do want consumers to be able to run nodes on their laptop, like on Ethereum. Could you give an overview of kind of the universe of scaling solutions that, can make it possible for, consumers to run it on the laptops while also, having a scalable and fast and cheap blockchain?
Wow, that is a great question. There are a number of different approaches, and I think the most common and probably the most relevant for this conversation are rollups, or probably optimistic rollups, and ZK rollups are the most common ones. There's also there are a lot of newer L1s that are trying to address this problem through different design choices and trade-offs. There's a number of different things you can do, but I think rollups will be the most relevant for the purpose of this conversation. And you could also talk about app chains as a scalability solution, but I don't really exclusively think of them.
Focusing on those rollups, I think, would be interesting for the audience. I know it's been a pretty big narrative in crypto lately. So kind of understanding, what a rollup does, why they're important, and maybe some of the differences between different types of rollups.
It's a good question. The idea of a rollup is essentially you're taking a bunch of transactions off of the L1, and you basically if you have 10,000 people transacting, you kind of net out all of the transactions between them, and you just post the difference on the L1. And assuming you are comfortable with all of the consensus and the trust assumptions made of the rollup, you're okay with just having sort of the end result posted to the L1. And that's usually a trade-off people are willing to make in the name of scalability. So that's sort of one surface level definition. I would say there's a lot of different ways that you can go about doing it. And people often call it sort of you end up executing all of the transactions and then you settle on the L1. People typically refer to it that way.
When we're looking at roll-up solutions and different ways of scaling on the layer 2s, there's two different approaches, really, mainly two different approaches right now. There's optimistic roll-ups and zero-knowledge roll-ups. Optimistic roll-ups, the role of the validator, which is there to ensure that the transactions that are occurring on the layer 2 are valid and confirmed. The role of the validator there is to assume that the transactions are valid and that fraud has not occurred, hence the term optimistic. And the fraud proof, which is the method by which any sort of fraudulent activity is proven to the rest of the network on the layer 2, there's a 7-day window after a transaction occurs for a fraud proof to be submitted. You often hear this role as being a watcher, a validator. Different networks call them different things. And this ensures that the kind of fidelity and the throughput of the system on the layer 2 is base level pretty high, because the majority of the time the fraud is not occurring, with then the option for kind of slashing and other penalties occurring once a fraud proof has been submitted and verified. So as a result of this mechanism, there's a 7-day window for your activity on Optimism or Arbitrum to settle back onto Ethereum layer 1 because of this 7-day waiting period associated with the fraud proof. Now, that's not the case in zero-knowledge rollups because of the fact that they are fully proving the validity of the contents of a transaction at the point. Lydia, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add. I'll just pause there.
Yeah, I think your point that you've alluded to is that there's this long waiting period in an optimistic rollup, which is kind of like the core drawback that makes a lot of people excited about the ZK side. There are a few disadvantages to zero knowledge side. Like it incurs some cryptographic overhead such that, until you're actually processing a very large number of transactions, it might be significantly less scalable than an optimistic rollup. There's actually a lot of interesting things you can do on the zero knowledge side, actually to like reconstruct an L1. So tons of interesting work being done there, all sort of in the name of scalability, but like it's a really powerful idea if basically right now, like if Nikita is running a node and I just joined the network and I want to sync to the current state, I could say, hey, Nikita, can you send me the current state of the blockchain? And he can send it to me, but he can send me whatever he wants. And I'm not comfortable with that. So instead, I ask him to send me every single block, which I break down into every transaction. I validate all of them myself and I catch up to the beginning of the chain. What you can do in zero knowledge is basically provide a proof that you have done a computation accurately. So like I could see a program that Nikita ran to validate this block or this set of transactions. And I can verify if I'm comfortable with what's written there. He can essentially prove to me that he's run it accurately. And then me saying, hey, Nikita, can you send me the current state of the blockchain? It's actually a much smaller trust assumption because he's cryptographically proven to me that he's executed correctly. And so, Nikita, feel free to pull me back up a level if that's too nuanced or too detailed, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff you can do there.
Lydia, I think that point is a great one, especially when we're looking at, and for those of you who aren't aware, syncing up with a blockchain is one of the lengthiest and most time-consuming aspects of spinning up a node. If there was a efficient mechanism by which you could transfer that data associated with the syncing up process in a verifiable manner, it would certainly ease some of the struggles with spinning up node networks that we currently face.
I think it takes a month right now to sync an Ethereum full node.
Yeah.
That's how long it takes your computer to re-verify every single transaction that's occurred, and catch up to the current block. I've never done it successfully. I've always given up after like a week or two.
That is an absurdly long amount of time. It shouldn't be that long.
It's not difficult. It's not a technically difficult problem. It's purely a waiting game. And if you have a really good computer, you could probably halve that time. But the problem is that even like Ethereum with relatively low throughput, lots of these things tend to get worse over time, right? Like the chain gets older, it takes longer and longer to sync. Also, the complexity of verifying a transaction tends to increase because, for example, if Nikita sends me a Bitcoin, or sorry, let's say he sends me 1 ETH, I have to be able to go as a node. I need to be able to go find Nikita's account address, make sure he actually has that ETH and that he appropriately signed the signature and like gave permission to hand this ETH over. And that's relatively easy if there's like 1,000 accounts, but if there's 1 billion accounts, it's actually really difficult for me to go and find his account on my computer. And so lots of these problems tend to get worse over time, which is why scalability is so important, because the alternative is to actually just lower throughput. And that's not a compelling, it's not a compelling alternative. So that's why there's so much focus on scalability in L2s right now.
So to those two problems that you mentioned or that you alluded to, specifically like how it takes a month, are there any proposed solutions right now to reduce the time, or is anyone working on this?
I think one aspect of insight that I can give here is that a lot of the infrastructure, you can establish a network whereby your nodes, especially if you're a node operator, are communicating a synced state or the current state with other with other nodes that you're trying to spin up. But for some of the infrastructure companies, if we take Figment, for example, Chorus One, some of the node providers that are around and have been validating all the various different networks for years now, their architecture is structured in such a way whereby for them to be able to establish this sort of data sharing mechanism, they would have to rebuild their entire technical stack. So I think it's just a matter of establishing new infrastructure systems whereby your nodes can communicate and efficiently exchange this data.
I think there's also, you can almost always increase scalability if you are willing to make additional trust assumptions, which like very crypto purists are all about minimizing trust assumptions. And so like one assumption I could make is that, Nikita is not lying to me and he just sends me the whole blockchain. And I say like, okay, I assume this is right. I'm going to keep on keeping on. And I would just, that's a pretty big trust assumption that most people aren't willing to make. And so there's a lot of like smaller versions of that you could try to do that a lot of people are working on. But, the roll-ups will help some of this because, like, for example, if there are 1,000, this point about it's hard to find Nikita's account and validate his transaction. Like, actually, if Nikita's not transacting on Ethereum, he's transacting on Arbitrum or Optimism. Ethereum is actually only keeping track of Optimism's account. And actually, there might be a little bit more complexity to that, but generally, a lot of the complexity is resolved indirectly through L2s and through other scaling solutions.
You mentioned this kind of trade-off between, trusting and scalability. And so, there's solutions like the Arbitrum Antitrust chain that obviously kind of takes advantage of this trade-off. Are there any other solutions that you're aware of that currently are kind of trading off, the trustlessness for more scalability?
A light client is one. Like a light client is a sort of stripped down version of an Ethereum full node, and you just validate block headers instead of the full block. It's much faster. But you are making trust assumptions that people are you have to then trust that the blocks that are communicated to you are valid, or the block headers are valid. There is an additional trust assumption there, and you are able to submit transactions through a light client, so they're much easier. But you're not sort of like a first-class citizen of the network on a light client, if that makes sense. So there are other solutions. Like Aragon is working on a fast sync technology. A lot of it you can actually just do by improving the software that allows you to sync and that allows you to validate transactions. So there's a lot of things, and they're not all in the same vein. Like you can make trust assumptions all over the place. And like a trust assumption would be using, Infura or Alchemy, like a centralized node provider, like, okay, I'm going to trust that they are not censoring my transactions. And thus it's much easier because running a node is a pain. So that's another example.
And a few more examples, but this is moving away slightly from the rollups. I agreed, Lydia, with light clients. I think it's interesting looking at the role of light clients historically within bridges as well, and kind of the assumptions associated there. But an example of kind of the altered trust assumptions is something like Calimero. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Calimero, but it's a private sharding environment on Near. And Near's got some pretty unique design structures that allows it to spin up something like private permission sharding. And that entire environment relies on altered trust assumptions.
Yeah. And just so we're all like speaking the same language. Sharding would basically mean that you split up all of your validators into different groups, and you say like this group of validators is going to validate this section of transactions, and then the groups are somehow going to come to consensus and agree with each other. And then the other thing that I always gloss over this, and I think it's a kind of a tough point to fully understand, is like there are validators, full nodes, and what I just threw in was a light client. Validators are the people who participate in consensus. They're like a miner. They like propose a block. They all vote on what the block is. They issue the block, and then the full nodes then take the blocks that were issued and then they validate them themselves. And we can talk about why they do that. And then a light client is just is kind of like a stripped down version of a full node that's easier to run. So just want to make sure that I actually found that to be, I was probably in crypto for like a year, embarrassingly, before I really understood the difference between those three parties. So just want to make sure that that's clear also.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for that. I often forget kind of prefacing some of the explanations with some more information. I think when we're looking at dynamic sharding on something like Near, it's interesting the availabilities that open up as soon as you start taking into consideration something like sharding. You can split transactions up by transaction type and issue them to a quorum or a set of validators that have specialized hardware for dealing with that transaction type. Just kind of allowing you to spin up environments that are highly specialized to handle the type of traffic that they're going to receive. And this is something that we've seen not necessarily within building from the ground up design, but if we look at Solana's Gazer plugin, for example, it's a plugin that has the functioning of, or the role of this plugin is to handle traffic associated with remote procedure calls, RPC requests from validators. So instead of the validators who are normally, tasked with ensuring the consensus, participating in consensus of the network, ensuring that they're not burdened with RPC requests and that some other hardware can handle that, allowing the validators enough time to maintain uptime on the network and so on and so forth. So I think sharding has a plethora of different applications that are just starting to be explored. And I expect kind of this gap between what we define as being a roll-up and what we define as sharding to somewhat decrease, because at the end of the day, we're just using specialized hardware for tasks.
Mike, what I find challenging about sharding is, like, okay, you can have groups of validators all agree on consensus of their shard, but it's actually really difficult to like figure out how to shard and then how to make these groups all come to consensus. And what you said is there's a group of specialized validators with specialized hardware, and like when you say that, it's really interesting. But what I hear there's a point of centralization there, because all of a sudden if you have 5 or 9 or 15, I don't know how many validators, but if you have like a pool of just a handful of validators that are responsible for like a critical part of consensus, you've really you've introduced centralization there in the name of scalability. Is that in that blockchain trilemma that we all talk about, it's really hard to get around introducing centralization. But let me know if I'm you are much more an expert on Near than I am, so if you disagree.
No, I completely agree with you, Lydia. I think it's something that's really important, and it's kind of one of those catch-22 situations, because we can't allow higher throughput by using specialized hardware without going through that trade-off to begin with. And it's something that we're seeing, whether it be not only in transactions between layer ones, but we're seeing it in message passing and kind of some of the other tertiary applications and utilizations of the technology as well. I think message passing is a good one to look at, especially when we look at layer zero's dependencies on some of the other infrastructure pieces.
When you say message passing, are you talking about basically bridging?
Yeah, just general message passing. So for example, shards could use a form of message passing to establish consensus between themselves.
I gotcha. The other thing I want to say is I do think this is an example of where zero knowledge is really exciting is because I think, like we talk about the trade-offs between centralization and scalability, and actually zero knowledge, you can actually you can almost not have to make that sacrifice. Like if you have the right scale and if you have the right proof that doesn't require doesn't have extremely high hardware requirements, you could actually get around this whole issue of 10,000 people re-executing the work that everyone else did, because you can like have one person do it and provide a proof to everyone else, and they all like they trust that you've provided a valid proof, but like it's not a lot, it's not a big trust assumption because you've cryptographically proven its validity. And so that's why I think people are super excited about the space. You can actually kind of like get out of that push-pull that's really difficult with traditional methods.
Yeah, I agree with your enthusiasm there, Lydia. I think zero knowledge, an interesting aspect of zero knowledge is that anywhere that you see a need for TTP, like trusted third party, which is pretty common actually, more common than I think people realize within current systems, that can essentially be replaced with zero knowledge. And the applications of that are far more broad than I think people initially realize.
Nikita, should we explain zero knowledge at all?
Yeah, I think that would be great to kind of give an introduction to zero knowledge, because I think that's a pretty complex subject.
It is a super complex subject that I'm still working on understanding myself, but I will explain it to the best of my ability. The idea is that, I want to be able to prove to Nikita, like I am the prover and Nikita is the party called the verifier. So I know something and I want to prove it to Nikita, and we want to be able to do that without sharing information. So basically I want to prove to Nikita that I executed this block accurately, but maybe I care about the privacy as a factor here, but basically maybe I want to show that this transaction is valid, but I don't want to give away that like Aryan spent $1,000 at Target yesterday. Maybe it's his transaction. He's embarrassed about it. He doesn't want Nikita to know. So I don't want Nikita to have access to that information, but I want to prove that it's true. So you basically go through some fancy cryptographic interaction that I wouldn't worry about because it's really complicated. And I can prove to Nikita such that he will actually believe me that I executed this transaction correctly. Like he should have very high confidence that I've done that. And there's, to your point, Aryan, there's a lot of actually non-blockchain applications that you can do with this. Like, for example, you could have, you could use zero knowledge to prove that a photo was taken by a specific camera. And that it wasn't tampered with, right? So like you could prove that a photo that was like taking a photo of your license plate when you were like, going through a toll booth and didn't pay. You could prove basically that the actual that the camera that took that photo was the right one and that photo wasn't edited. And there's a lot of interesting non-blockchain use cases for that. So like in the media space, for example, avoiding deep fakes, right? Like Nikita, you could sign cryptographically a video of a recording of yourself, and then people might be able to distinguish between a deep fake because it wouldn't have that same signature.
I had no idea that I had those real world applications. Are there any other, I guess, applications besides just ZK rollups? Because I think, everyone's heard about ZK rollups, but, what is ZK technology being used for? What could it be used for?
Lots of things. So I think you can use it in bridging, which maybe that's a topic for another day, but bridging has a lot in common with rollups. Bridging is getting two blockchains to talk to each other, basically. And you could also call it a messaging, but the sort of generic term is bridging. And the other big one is privacy, like privacy preserving applications. So for example, if you were a DAO and you like right now, your payroll would be on chain. Everyone would be able to see what you got paid. So people might use zero knowledge to try to preserve your privacy. And thus you can say like, look, I've paid Nikita. Everyone can agree that I paid him. We'll all update his balance, but we can basically obfuscate the actual amount that he was paid so that all of your coworkers don't know what you were paid. So lots of applications where you'd want to protect privacy.
And it's the same with identity services as well. If you issue a NFT that's supposed to represent your identity across Web3, you're going to want to have that as part of a privacy preserving protocol when you're interacting with anything. So there's a lot of applications that I think we're just starting to uncover now, and the full extent of it and the full applicability of it, I think, is to be explored, because we haven't got to the point whereby the cryptography on the so there's two aspects of a zero knowledge rollup, and a zero knowledge rollup, as Lydia mentioned earlier, can be quite prohibitive in terms of actually executing, because it is quite cryptographically dense right now, and there's a lot of work that's need to be done by the computer to prove zero knowledge proofs. And I think on the cryptographic, so there's two aspects that come into play here. There's the hardware strength of the machine. People are using highly specialized hardware like field programmable gate arrays to conduct some of these proofs. But then there's also the cryptographic side of it that is being iterated on. And some of these algorithms, they've been around since the days of error correcting codes, which were back in like the early days of CS in like the 80s. So we're talking about cryptography that hasn't really been specialized in terms of application for what we're using them for. And I think this is an area of high exploration that I personally am really excited about. Lydia, I would love to hear how you're thinking about it as well.
On the hardware side or on the sort of like cryptographic design side?
Cryptographic design, like when we've got Plonky 2, for example, now, and just kind of how we've seen Block 16 change over the years.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it will be, we can get super deep on the cryptography here, and I'll spare the audience of some of the extreme details. But, for example, like we are actively working with a portfolio company to implement a cryptographic algorithm called a ZK Stark. It's the Stark. So that it was basically created 3 years ago. And so like some of this technology is old and some of it's very, very new and actively being iterated on. And it's one of the reasons that the field of blockchain is still quite academic, because a lot of these problems are actually academic problems, and they're solved at universities via academic papers and researchers, more so than you'll see in like the traditional software world, where software is more like here's something we want to build. Everyone knows it can be built. Like, let's go build it. Whereas in crypto, with all of the zero knowledge stuff, people are actually trying to design algorithms that are more efficient, that don't exist right now. And so there's just a lot of deep, very technical research that's being done. We can also talk more at some point about specific types of algorithms we're interested in.
Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate the discussion. It's been really insightful. So both of you, thank you.